They didn't listen when you spoke. You told them how you felt, again and again, not in anger, not in chaos. You used calm words, honest ones. You sat down, lowered your voice, and explained yourself. You didn't accuse. You didn't shout. You just asked to be heard. But they didn't really listen. They nodded, maybe said sorry, but they didn't change. And that told you everything. You gave them so many chances to understand, to meet you in the middle. You repeated yourself, not because you liked the sound of your own voice, but because you believed maybe this time it would land. That maybe the reason they weren't changing was because they didn't fully get it yet. So you tried again, with softer words, then firmer ones, then silence, and still nothing. They thought you were just venting, that you were tired, emotional, that you'd calm down and come back to normal. That was the biggest mistake they made, believing your honesty was temporary, that you'd get over it like you always did. They didn't realize your words were warnings, that your voice was a final invitation to step up before you stepped away. It's easy to ignore someone when they love you too much to leave. They relied on that. They banked on your softness. They bet that no matter how many times they overlooked your needs, you'd stay. You always had. You forgave quickly. You moved on easily. You gave benefit of the doubt, even when the truth was screaming. They took that grace and treated it like a free pass. They heard you speak, but they never listened. There's a difference. Listening is remembering, adjusting, trying. They did none of that. They shrugged off your pain, called you dramatic, sensitive, said you always make things bigger than they are. But your pain was real. Your exhaustion was real. They just didn't care enough to sit in the discomfort of hearing it. You told them you were tired. You said it kindly at first. I feel unseen. I don't feel appreciated. I feel alone, even with you here. But they brushed it off. They said you were overthinking. They said they were busy. They said it wasn't a big deal. Then you said it louder, through actions, through emotional distance, through the way you stopped lighting up around them. Still, they didn't take it seriously. There were moments you almost broke, trying to make them understand. You cried in silence after conversations that left you emptier than before. You rehearsed how to say it better next time, as if it was your fault they weren't listening, as if the clarity of your message was the issue, but it wasn't. They just didn't want to carry what they caused. Some people only want the parts of you that don't require accountability. They want the laughs, the loyalty, the support, but they don't want to be responsible for the damage they cause. They want access without effort. And when you finally say, "This hurts," they make you feel like you're ruining the peace. But there was no peace, just your silence, holding it together. They thought you'd never go quiet for real. They thought you'd always find a way back to softness, that even after being unheard, you'd still try again. But something shifted, not in one dramatic moment. It was gradual, word by word. Your trust cracked. Every time they dismissed your feelings, something inside you started pulling away, until one day there was nothing left to say. They noticed your silence eventually, when it no longer felt like a break, but a boundary, when your presence wasn't just physically absent, but emotionally unreachable. That's when they started to panic. They asked what was wrong, finally, but by then it was too late. You had spent all your energy trying to be heard. Now you had nothing left to explain. You didn't shut down because you were angry. You shut down because you were done. Done trying to convince people to care. Done begging for the bare minimum. Done repeating yourself like your needs were optional. Silence wasn't the beginning of distance. It was the result of repeated neglect. They didn't notice how many times you showed up crying, but pretended to be okay. How many nights you stayed up thinking of better ways to explain yourself. How many times you chose understanding over pride, empathy over ego, and how each time you were met with indifference. That's what silenced you. The steady erosion of being unseen, unheard, unvalued. You stopped speaking because talking became pointless. The words lost meaning. They bounced off walls, off ears that only worked when the room was burning. By then, you'd already packed up your energy and placed it somewhere safe, somewhere quiet, somewhere they don't have access to anymore. They miss your voice now, your softness, your presence, but not because they understand, because they lost control. They don't miss what you said. They miss what your availability did for them. But you see that now. You finally see that speaking only matters if the other person values your voice. Otherwise, it's just noise they tune out. You said everything they needed to hear. You said it clearly. You gave them time. You gave them grace. You gave them you. They didn't listen. And now, they don't get another chance. The message was always there. They just weren't paying attention. And now that you're gone, they're replaying everything you ever said, trying to figure out the exact moment they lost you. You used to type paragraphs just to explain why you were quiet, why you distanced yourself, why your energy shifted. You'd start with, "I just wanted to say this before it's misunderstood," as if you owed people your reasons, as if silence meant guilt. You felt the need to over-explain even the smallest boundary, like protecting your peace was something you had to defend. And they still didn't understand. Or maybe they did, and just didn't care. You broke your own rules just to keep certain people comfortable. You let things slide, then tried to explain why it hurt later. You'd lay it all out, your triggers, your trauma, your truth. They'd nod, say, "I hear you," but their actions never changed. You thought maybe if you said it the right way, they'd finally see you. That maybe clarity would bring respect. It didn't. You became fluent in giving people a roadmap to your soul, and they still got lost on purpose. You had to explain why you loved too hard, why you forgave too quickly, why you gave more than you got. They called it dramatic, said you were too sensitive, too emotional, but they only said that after they hurt you and didn't want to take accountability. So you softened your words, watered down your feelings, tried not to come off too much. And even then, it was too much for them. You tried to make it easier for them to understand you. You translated your pain into something palatable. You made your absence gentle, your boundaries polite, but it never made a difference. The people who wanted to understand never needed the essay. They could read your silence. The rest, they were just there for the version of you that didn't demand anything. You spent years thinking that being misunderstood was your fault, that if you just explained better, they'd stop hurting you. So you did, over and over. You explained why you were tired, why you were quiet, why you couldn't show up the way you used to, why their jokes cut deep, why their absence mattered, why their inconsistencies weren't harmless. And still, they asked what your problem was. Still, they told you it wasn't that serious. Still, they painted you as dramatic, moody, distant. You apologized for things you should have been angry about. You made excuses for them when they gave you bare minimum. You used, "They're just going through something," to justify disrespect. You tried to believe they didn't mean it, that they didn't know better. So you kept teaching, explaining, waiting for growth that never came. You started to realize how draining it was to constantly narrate your worth to people who only showed up for the parts of you that were easy to love. You noticed how they were only present when you made things convenient, how they disappeared the moment you asked for something real. They didn't want the full you, just the parts that served them, the soft words, the unconditional support, the blind loyalty. You talked about your loyalty like it was something they should value. You'd explain how you were always there, always consistent, always honest. They didn't care. Loyalty means nothing to someone who thinks access is a guarantee. You weren't appreciated. You were expected. They counted on you to keep giving, and when you finally stopped, they called you distant. Even your kindness had to be explained. You told people why you showed up, even when you were breaking, why you forgave things that destroyed your spirit. They didn't call it strength. They called it weakness, took advantage of it, then labeled you cold when you stopped giving without limits. You watched people drain you and then get offended when you needed time to breathe. And the hardest part, you still wanted to be understood, even after the silence, after the disappointment, after the disrespect. You still hoped someone would finally get it, that they'd read what you wrote, hear the tone in your voice, recognize the exhaustion in your body. You wanted someone to say, "You don't have to explain. I see it. I feel it." But that rarely happened. And the more you kept talking, the more you started to realize you weren't being heard. You were just being tolerated. You kept over-communicating with people who undercared. People who listened for flaws, not feelings. People who asked, "What's wrong?" only to flip it back on you. The conversation started to feel rehearsed, like you were performing healing for people who never earned your vulnerability. You could feel it every time, how hollow it became, how much you were begging to be seen, and how easily they looked away. So you stopped. One day, without warning, you just didn't send the long message. You let the misunderstanding stand. You didn't correct their assumptions. You didn't defend your silence. You didn't explain your growth. You started walking away from anyone who needed a manual to handle you. Not because you didn't care anymore, but because you cared too much for too long, and it almost destroyed you. You don't send essays now. You don't revisit old conversations. You don't unpack your pain for temporary visitors. You let people feel your absence. Let them guess why you're gone. If they really cared, they wouldn't need the breakdown. You stopped offering explanations to people who only ever showed up for your convenience. Now you move without announcing it. You heal without broadcasting it. You love without losing yourself in the process. And the silence, it's finally peaceful. You told them, not just once. You told them gently, hoping they'd care. Then firmly, hoping they'd take it seriously. You said what you needed, said how their actions hurt, said what would happen if things didn't change. You weren't dramatic. You weren't loud, just honest. But honesty doesn't matter when people think your presence is permanent. When they think your love comes with no terms, no limits, no consequences. They didn't listen, not really. They nodded, maybe even said sorry, but nothing changed. The same patterns, the same dismissals, the same silence when you needed them. You gave chance after chance, hoping this time it would click. That maybe your pain would finally mean something to them. That maybe, just maybe, they'd fight for you the way you fought for them. But they didn't. They never did. They thought your love was infinite, that you'd always stay, that no matter how tired you were, how disrespected you felt, how hollow their presence had become, you'd keep showing up, because that's who you were. The one who forgave, the one who stayed loyal, even when it hurt. You gave warning signs like gifts, one after another, clear, calm, intentional. But they took them as noise, as drama, as empty threats. They underestimated you. They mistook your kindness for fear. They thought silence meant weakness. But what they didn't understand was every warning came with a boundary you were slowly learning how to enforce. Every ignored message built a wall. Every broken promise laid a brick. You weren't bluffing. You were building an exit. You remember how it felt, watching them disregard your feelings like you were exaggerating. They didn't take you seriously because your love had always been so easy to access, so unconditional. You remember the conversations, the ones where you sat there, explaining how you felt, only to be told you were too sensitive or overthinking. They acted like your discomfort was an inconvenience, like your expectations were too much. So you softened the warning. You blamed yourself. Maybe I should have said it better. Maybe I'm being unreasonable. You tried every angle, gentle, honest, director, quiet. Even silence was a warning. But they never noticed. Or maybe they did and just didn't care. Either way, nothing changed. They never thought the day would come when you'd actually walk away, until you did. And when you left, you didn't announce it. You didn't scream. You didn't beg them to notice the distance. You just became unavailable, emotionally first, then physically. You stopped checking in, stopped answering quickly, stopped explaining your silence. You let the distance speak for itself. And suddenly, they started paying attention. But it was too late. They felt the shift, the absence, the quiet that used to be filled with effort, with care, with you. Now it's empty. They didn't take your words seriously, so now they sit with your silence. And that silence isn't empty. It's loaded with everything they ignored. Every conversation you had, every chance you gave, every warning they thought they could get away with one more time. You didn't want to leave angry. You didn't want revenge. You just wanted peace, consistency, someone to match your energy. But peace doesn't come from staying where you're constantly explaining your worth. So you stopped. No long speech, no emotional outburst, just action, quiet, clean, final. And now they sit with what they chose, the versions of you they dismissed, the words they didn't take seriously, the love they wasted. They say they didn't see it coming, but they did. They just never believed you'd follow through. They heard every warning, but they thought they still had time. Now they send messages you don't open, type paragraphs you don't read. They call, hoping you'll answer like before. But you don't, because they don't get that version of you anymore. The one that explained, the one that pleaded. That version is gone. It died quietly, right in front of them, while they looked the other way. You don't hate them. You don't even want them to suffer. You just don't want them back. That's the part they never expected. That one day, you'd stop explaining and just remove yourself completely. No warning, no flair, just absence. And that absence burns louder than any final conversation could. They called it love when you stayed. They called it drama when you spoke up. Now they call it silence when you've left. But you know the truth. This was never sudden. It was built over time, layered with every ignored warning, with every broken promise, with every time you swallowed your own needs to keep the connection alive. Now they feel the gap, They realize the consistency they thought was guaranteed is gone. You were never trying to punish them. You were trying to be heard. And when you weren't, you chose yourself. That's not revenge. That's growth. That's what happens when someone finally realizes explanations don't fix disrespect. You don't have time for lessons anymore. You're not their teacher. You're not their healer. You're not the one they can hurt and still expect to stay. That role is closed. That chapter is finished. You speak through action now, not out of cruelty, out of necessity, out of preservation, out of knowing your worth in ways they never could. They'll remember the warnings, not because you repeat them, but because your absence confirms every one of them. You used to think communication could fix anything, that if you just said it the right way, they'd get it. You believed that being honest, being vulnerable, being real would be enough. So you kept talking. You kept explaining. You repeated yourself until your voice was tired. You tried to break things down gently, tried to make it make sense, tried to help them see your heart. But it didn't matter, because they only heard what they wanted to hear. They heard the parts that made them feel comfortable, the praise, the forgiveness, the parts that didn't challenge them. But the moment you spoke about your needs, your pain, your boundaries, they shut down. They got defensive. You weren't attacking, but they took it as one. You weren't rejecting them. You were protecting yourself, but they couldn't tell the difference. Or maybe they just didn't care to. You realized they didn't really want to understand you. They wanted to stay comfortable around you. They didn't want to be held accountable. They wanted access without responsibility. They wanted your softness, but not your standards. So when you said no, it sounded like betrayal to them. When you said "this hurts me," they heard criticism. When you asked for space, they heard abandonment. Your silence became their problem only when it stopped serving them. When you were quiet and still gave, they were fine. When you were quiet and started to protect your peace, suddenly you were different, cold, selfish. But they weren't calling you selfish when you sacrificed sleep to help them, when you carried emotions that didn't belong to you, when you put their feelings above your own every single time. They only noticed your change when it no longer benefited them. You used to defend yourself. You used to over-explain, hoping they'd finally see your side. You broke your own boundaries trying to justify them. You watered down your truth to avoid hurting theirs. You softened your tone so they wouldn't call you aggressive. You apologized for needing space, for needing time, for needing anything at all. And they got used to that. They expected you to shrink whenever they felt uncomfortable. But that version of you is gone now. Now you say it once, maybe twice. After that you go quiet. Not out of spite, but out of self-respect. You don't argue with people who are committed to misunderstanding you. You don't explain your boundaries anymore. You just set them and let people decide if they can respect them. If they can't, you stop giving access. It's not revenge, it's alignment. You protect your peace, even if it makes other people uncomfortable. Some people only want you around when you're easy, when you're saying yes, when you're giving without limits. The moment you ask for reciprocity, they switch. They say you've changed, that you're too much, that you've lost yourself. But the truth is, you finally found yourself. You found the strength to stop being silent about what you need, and they didn't like that version. You remember the moments when you tried to speak up, when your voice shook, but you spoke anyway. When you said, "That hurt me." When you asked, "Can you just show up for me this time?" And you remember how they responded. Not with care, not with growth, but with deflection, with silence, with anger. They made it about them. They made your pain an inconvenience. So now, you don't bother. Not because you've given up, but because you've woken up. You've accepted that some people can't meet you where you are. And that's okay. You don't need to drag them there anymore. You're not a fixer. You're not a translator. You're a person with limits. And those limits are allowed to exist. You used to speak for connection. Now you speak for clarity. And when clarity isn't possible, you walk away. No drama, no closure, no long goodbye. Just distance, quiet, steady distance. Let them call it whatever they want. They always will. You don't have to be the villain in their story, but you also don't have to keep bleeding to prove you weren't. They misunderstood your silence because it didn't benefit them. They misunderstood your honesty because it required them to reflect. And they misunderstood your boundaries because they were used to your access being unconditional. But you've changed, and now they're uncomfortable. Not because you're cruel, but because you finally stopped betraying yourself for the sake of keeping them close. There's peace in knowing that you no longer have to break yourself down to be understood. You no longer have to explain why you need space, why you walked away, why you don't show up the same. If they cared, they would have listened the first time. They would have asked. They would have met you halfway. They didn't. And now, they don't get another explanation. Your silence is not disrespect. It's preservation. Your distance is not punishment. It's clarity. You still care. But you care for yourself now, too. You don't trade your peace for potential anymore. You don't argue with people whose egos are louder than their empathy. You let them go, and you keep going, without the weight of trying to make them understand what they were never ready to receive. There was a time you would have stayed up all night just to fix a misunderstanding. Time didn't matter. Sleep didn't matter. You would write long messages, explain your side, try to bring peace to people who only brought chaos. You kept thinking if you could just communicate better, maybe they would hear you, maybe they'd see you. But the truth is, they heard you the whole time. They just didn't care. Or they cared when it was convenient, when your voice benefited them. You thought empathy would be enough, that if you showed compassion, it would be returned. You gave people every chance to make it right. You repeated yourself. You softened your tone. You let things slide, just to keep the connection alive. You made yourself smaller, so others wouldn't feel uncomfortable. You absorbed the blame, carried the weight, and stayed in spaces that drained you. All in the name of love, all for peace, all for the hope that things would shift. They didn't. You kept explaining yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you, people who heard your pain and responded with silence, or worse, sarcasm. You said, "This hurts," and they said, "You're too sensitive." You said, "This doesn't feel fair," and they said, "You're being dramatic." So you stopped speaking, not because you had nothing left to say, but because they never deserved to hear it in the first place. You started realizing something. If someone truly cared, you wouldn't have to explain your worth more than once. You wouldn't have to ask for basic respect. You wouldn't have to keep begging to be heard. Communication only works when both people want to understand each other. When one side is performing and the other is avoiding, that's not a relationship. It's emotional labor, and you were the one doing all of it. So you stopped, not out of anger, not out of pride, just out of exhaustion. You grew tired of talking to walls, tired of repeating the same things to people who refused to grow, tired of explaining your boundaries to people who only saw them as temporary. You were giving energy to people who would have watched you drown just to stay dry themselves. So now, you save that energy for yourself. You no longer write long messages. You don't ask for clarity. You don't fight to stay in people's lives. If they want to go, you let them. If they don't show up, you stop reminding them. You stopped being emotionally available to people who disappear when it's your turn to lean on them. You stopped making space for people who only make time when it's easy. There's no announcement, no post, no big goodbye. You just move different. They feel it before you say a word. They notice the silence, the distance, and they wonder what happened. But you won't explain, because the version of you that used to explain is gone. You let them talk. You let them twist the narrative. You let them believe whatever helps them sleep. You're not responsible for their perception anymore. You're not building bridges you didn't burn. You're not fixing what they repeatedly broke. You're not revisiting wounds just to prove they existed. If they didn't care when you were hurting, they don't get to care now that you've gone quiet. If they weren't listening when you were loud, they don't deserve access when you're still. They say you've changed, that you're cold, that you're distant, and they're right. You changed because staying the same was costing you too much. You became distant because being close meant being drained. You're not cold. You're careful. You still feel everything. You just don't show it to people who used your softness as leverage. You learned that the loudest move you can make is to stop explaining yourself, to stop trying to be the bigger person in a room full of people who never met you halfway. You realized that walking away without a word is not weakness. It's clarity. It's knowing that not every closure needs a conversation. Some goodbyes are silent. Some endings are private. You stopped needing them to understand, because their understanding was never the goal. Peace was. You stopped arguing, stopped proving, stopped giving people room to hurt you twice. You don't wait for them to see your side. You don't ask them to change. You don't need their apology, their growth, their acknowledgement. You just need your space, and you take it unapologetically. Now, when people show you who they are, you believe it the first time. You don't excuse the patterns. You don't defend the disrespect. You don't sit in places that no longer serve you out of history or habit. You move quietly, with focus, with purpose, without noise, without explanation. You protect your time like it's sacred, because it is. You no longer offer it to people who don't value it. You don't answer every call. You don't reply to every message. You don't attend every conversation that feels like a trap. You don't entertain confusion from people who had every chance to be clear. You act, you leave, you block, you stay away, and you don't explain. They say silence is cruel, but silence is healing. It's protection, it's freedom, and you earned it. The time for talking is over. You've said enough. Now everything speaks for itself. You used to wait for the right time, wait for the green light, wait for someone to say they believed in you. You'd stall your own progress because someone hesitated. You'd question your decision just because they didn't clap. You'd overthink every step, afraid it was too bold, too fast, too loud. You didn't want to be too much. You didn't want to upset anyone. You wanted them to be comfortable with your growth. You shrank for people who never made space for you. Now you're done waiting. You're done needing someone's nod to move forward. You're not asking anymore. You're not hoping they'll understand. You're not slowing down to carry people who were never meant to walk beside you. You gave them enough chances. You gave enough explanations, and all they gave you back was hesitation, doubt, or silence. You don't need to be told you're ready. You are. You always were. You just didn't want to lose people along the way. But now, if they get left behind, they get left. If they get uncomfortable with your pace, they'll have to deal with it. You're no longer dimming your light to make others feel okay in the dark. You're no longer starving your vision to keep others full. That phase of your life is over. You don't need their permission to grow. You don't need their blessing to heal. You don't need their support to win. You used to wait for people to understand your dreams before chasing them. You wanted to be understood, wanted to be seen. You'd explain your moves before you made them, thinking they'd respect your clarity. They didn't. They just used that information to measure you, to doubt you, to delay you. They couldn't see the big picture, so they tried to keep you small. And you let them because you didn't want to walk alone. You were so scared of isolation that you accepted limitation. Now you know better. You know your decisions aren't up for discussion. You know not everyone will get it. Some never will. Some aren't meant to. That's not your problem anymore. You've wasted enough time trying to make everyone comfortable with your discomfort. You used to give updates. Now you give results. You used to ask for feedback. Now you trust your instincts. You're not moving for approval. You're moving for freedom. You spent years explaining yourself to people who didn't even care. They just liked the control, the idea that you'd wait, that you'd doubt yourself long enough for them to feel superior. They made you feel guilty for wanting more. They told you to be realistic, to be grateful, to calm down. And for a while, you listened. Because you thought they knew better. Because you were taught that being considerate meant always compromising. But not anymore. You've learned the hard way that some people only cheer for you when they can claim credit. Some only show up when it benefits them. Some only respect boundaries they set. You were expected to explain every no, justify every move, dilute every ambition. But you got tired. Tired of playing small so others wouldn't feel insecure. Tired of apologizing for wanting peace, growth, silence, separation. Now your choices are yours, fully, without compromise, without needing a second opinion. If they misunderstand you, that's fine. If they say you've changed, they're right. If they say you're cold, let them. They don't know what it took to get here. They didn't sit with you through the doubt. They didn't lift you when you were crumbling. They didn't encourage you when your hands were shaking and your voice was gone, so they don't get a vote. You're walking through doors now without announcing it. You're building things no one knows about. You're saying no without a reason. You're leaving when you've had enough, not when they finally push you over the edge. That's the difference. That's the shift. You used to stay and explain why you were uncomfortable. Now you walk away and let them figure it out. You don't owe anyone your softness when they only show up for the benefits. You don't owe anyone your silence when your voice is needed. And you don't owe anyone a watered-down version of your truth just because they can't handle your full self. You've learned to honor your boundaries without guilt. You've learned that the right people don't need a warning. They'll feel your standards and rise to meet them. The wrong ones. They'll try to guilt you for growing. Let them misunderstand. Let them talk. You don't care about optics anymore. You care about outcomes. You care about your mental clarity, your peace, your forward motion. You've traded explanations for execution, traded potential for purpose. You've traded patience for presence. You're not waiting to be chosen anymore. You've chosen yourself. Action is the only language now. Quiet, intentional action. You don't need to be louder, just consistent. They won't see it coming. They never do, because they spent so long underestimating you, so long thinking you'd keep playing small. But now you're rising without announcements, changing without validation, moving without noise. You're not soft anymore. You're certain. You're not hoping they'll understand. You're not even checking if they noticed. You're too far ahead, too focused, too done explaining what they never appreciated to begin with. You're acting now, and you're not turning around to see who's watching. You used to explain everything. Why you were hurt, why you pulled back, why you reacted the way you did. You wrote long messages hoping they'd understand. You waited for the right moment to bring it up. You thought communication would fix things. You thought if they just heard your side, they'd finally change. But they didn't, not because you weren't clear, but because they didn't care enough to listen. So now you don't explain. You don't repeat yourself. You don't go in circles trying to help someone understand something they're committed to ignoring. You just move quietly. You stop showing up. You stop checking in. You stop being the one who always fixes the energy. There's no argument, no announcement. You don't tell people they've lost access. You just take it away. You stop replying. You mute them, unfollow them, block if needed. Not because you're being petty, but because you're done handing out emotional availability to people who only drain it. You don't need to throw a scene. You don't need a goodbye speech. You don't owe anyone closure if they handed you confusion. They felt no need to protect your peace when they had access to it. Now they don't. The silence isn't cold. It's measured. It's intentional. It's what happens when you finally respect yourself enough to stop entertaining things that hurt. Some people only respond when they lose your attention. Not your affection, your attention. That's what they're addicted to. The access. The knowing you're still there. Still watching. Still hoping. So you cut it. Quietly. Without warning. You're not chasing anymore. Not conversations. Not closure. Not understanding. Not relationships that require you to lower your voice, shrink your feelings, or beg for consistency. If someone can't recognize your worth in your presence, they can sit with the silence of your absence. You don't spell it out anymore. You don't send follow-up texts asking what went wrong. You know what went wrong. You stayed too long. You explained too much. You gave too many chances. Now your silence speaks for you. It says everything you used to cry about, everything you used to argue for, everything you thought you had to prove. Now you say nothing. You let distance say it. You let absence speak. You let your calm destroy what chaos couldn't fix. You no longer write about how tired you are. You're just not tired anymore. You're done. People feel it. They won't admit it, but they do. Your absence creates a space they can't fill. Because it wasn't about what you did. It was about who you were. You were consistent, present, emotionally available. The one they vented to, leaned on, took from. You were there. And now you're not. And that's louder than any final conversation could be. They start to notice. The messages slow. The tags stop. You don't respond to their stories. You don't comment like you used to. You don't ask how they're doing. You don't show up when they call. There's no drama, no fight, just absence. And it unsettles them because they were expecting noise, expecting a scene, but you gave them silence. And that's harder to handle, because silence leaves space for reflection, and reflection is uncomfortable, especially for those who never thought they'd lose you. They scroll back through old messages, try to reread what you said, look for clues. They thought you were permanent, thought you'd always explain, always try again, always forgive. But not this time. This time you walked away without saying a word. And that wordlessness says more than any text ever could. There's peace in that, in knowing you don't need to be loud to reclaim your power. You don't need to make people understand what they never cared to learn. You don't need to be liked to feel valid. You don't need to be seen to feel real. You don't have to explain why your energy shifted. If they notice the change, they already know the reason. You're not ghosting, you're protecting, you're preserving what's left of yourself, the version that still loves, still cares, still hopes, but only for those who handle it with respect. You're not shutting down, you're filtering, separating the ones who deserve a seat at your table from the ones who only showed up when they were hungry. You used to feed everyone. Now you feed peace. You speak a new language now, one where silence is the answer to disrespect, where distance is the response to manipulation, where absence replaces explanations. You don't argue with people committed to misunderstanding you. You don't stay where you're tolerated out of habit. You don't keep giving your light to people who prefer the dark. There's power in becoming unreachable to those who only valued your presence when it was convenient. Power in no longer needing to clear your name in rooms you don't belong in. Power in walking away without needing to be chased. You still feel everything, still love deeply, but now it's guarded. Now it's quiet. Now it's earned. Your peace no longer comes with warning signs. Your limits aren't up for discussion. Your decisions are final. And that's not anger, that's growth. You've learned that not every connection deserves conversation. Some just need distance and silence. Not out of hate, out of clarity, out of self-respect, out of finally understanding that the loudest move is no longer proving yourself. It's disappearing without a sound. You used to wait for the right moment, the right mood, the right words. You told yourself you needed to feel more prepared, more healed, more confident. But days turned into months, and months into years. You kept stalling because fear sounded like logic. You thought if you waited long enough, the fear would go away. It never did. You kept thinking the right version of yourself would show up tomorrow. The braver one, the louder one, the one who didn't second-guess everything. So you made plans, wrote goals, filled notebooks with strategy, but you never moved. You were convincing yourself that standing still was part of the process. That hesitation was wisdom. It wasn't. It was fear in disguise. You dressed up your doubts like discipline, said you were thinking it through, said you needed time. But what you really needed was to believe in yourself for 5 seconds longer than the doubt lasted. That was it. And no one told you that. No one told you the strength doesn't come before the leap. It comes after. You kept waiting for your voice to stop shaking, waiting to feel calm, collected, ready. But it never came. Every opportunity passed while you rehearsed. Every breakthrough floated by while you rewrote your plan again and again. You missed so many chances because you thought perfect was the starting point. It's not. It's a lie that keeps people frozen. You didn't trust your own timing, so you gave your power away. You asked others if now was the time. You waited for someone to give you permission, but no one came. No one ever does. Because no one can feel your urgency. No one can understand what you've buried beneath all that waiting. No one's coming to save you from hesitation. That's on you. It's not that you didn't want it. You wanted it so badly it kept you awake at night. But you wanted it to feel safe, and it never did. Growth doesn't feel safe. Moving forward without knowing the outcome doesn't feel safe. But that's where all the change lives, in the uncomfortable. You didn't start because you weren't scared. You started because staying stuck scared you more. That shift changed everything. You decided the fear of regret would hurt worse than the fear of failing. And you were right. Regret lingers longer. It echoes. It questions you at night. Failure is loud but short. Regret is quiet but endless. You moved with shaking hands. You spoke while your voice cracked. You started building, even when your thoughts screamed you weren't enough. You didn't feel brave, but you did it anyway. That's real courage. It's not about confidence. It's about movement. You learned that the action creates the strength. The doing creates the belief. Confidence doesn't come first. It comes after the reps, after the risks, after the mistakes. You started showing up before you felt ready. You began writing, speaking, trying, without knowing how it would be received. And it didn't feel right at first. It felt forced. It felt messy. But it was real. And that was enough. You stopped trying to be impressive and focused on being consistent. You didn't need to be loud. You just needed to stop being silent. You learned to live with the fear instead of waiting for it to leave. You let it walk beside you. Let it speak while you worked. Let it shake your voice, but not your decisions. And slowly, you noticed something. The fear didn't disappear, but it got quieter. Not because it left, but because you stopped giving it control. Now when the fear speaks, you move anyway. When the doubt rises, you take the step. Not because you're sure, but because you've learned that waiting never brings peace. Only motion does. You've taught yourself that the version of you who acts through uncertainty is more powerful than the one who waits for clarity. You're no longer waiting for the stars to align. You stopped needing everything to make sense before taking the leap. You've realized most of the world's success was built by people who started scared, who were insecure, who didn't have a full plan. But they moved. That's the only difference. They moved. You don't need more motivation. You need movement. You need to do it scared. To speak while your voice shakes. To walk even if the path is blurry. Because waiting doesn't make the fear go away. It just wastes time. And you've already lost too much of that. You're not perfect. You're not completely healed. But you're ready. Not because everything feels right, but because staying stuck feels wrong. That's what readiness really is. It's not about confidence. It's about refusal. Refusal to wait another year, another season, another version of yourself that may never arrive. You're done waiting to be chosen. You've chosen yourself. That's the part no one tells you. That the moment you stop looking around and start moving forward, the entire energy around you changes. The hesitation starts to fade. Not because it's gone, but because you're in motion now. You've accepted that messy movement is better than perfect plans. That silence doesn't always mean thinking. Sometimes it means fear. And the only way to silence that fear is with action, with motion, with proof. So now you act, even when your hands shake, even when the voice in your head says, not yet. You say, now, because now is all you've got. And now, finally, is enough. You don't even speak on it anymore. You just move. You don't owe them words. They can feel it. You walk in differently now. You don't shrink in rooms that used to suffocate you. You don't explain your silence, your absence, your distance. You just are. And that's what confuses them most. The absence of chaos, the quiet shift. It's in the way you look at them now. Not with anger, not even with sadness. Just indifference. That clean, cold kind of indifference that says you're no longer reachable. They used to know how to trigger you, what to say to get you emotional, what button to press to make you defend yourself, beg, overtalk. But now you just blink, stay calm, say nothing. You don't respond with rage anymore. You respond with space. You used to write long messages to fix misunderstandings. Now you let people misunderstand you. If they wanted clarity, they would have treated you better when they had access to your voice. They feel the energy, even in your silence, especially in your silence. It's not that you hate them. You don't. You've just accepted what they are, who they've chosen to be. You've stopped negotiating with disrespect. You used to be loud about your pain, loud about what they did. Now you're just gone. You don't post about it. You don't talk about it. You just move like they don't exist. That's louder than any words you could ever say. You used to check your phone, hoping for apologies. Now it stays on silent. You used to chase closure. Now you close doors without waiting for anyone to understand why. Because you've realized that people understand exactly what they're doing. They just don't expect you to finally stop forgiving it. But you did. Quietly, fully, without a show. You're not colder. You're just clearer. You know your patterns now. You recognize the energy that drains you. The way your body tightens when someone's presence doesn't feel safe. You don't question that feeling anymore. You trust it. You trust yourself. That's the shift. And they notice. They feel the way your replies have changed, the way your eyes don't light up for them anymore, the way your tone stays even, flat, unbothered. They try to provoke something, guilt, emotion, reaction, but you don't give it. You don't explain. You don't defend. You don't offer comfort to those who once left you in emotional pieces. They feel it now, the switch. That heavy pause where your energy used to be soft and open. You used to beg people to stay. Now you stay quiet when they leave. You used to reach out after every conflict. Now you just let them go. You used to try to fix everything. Now you protect your peace before you protect their feelings. People notice when your energy is no longer centered around proving your worth. They notice when you stop chasing, stop caring out loud. It shakes them, not because you're doing something wrong, but because they were used to the version of you that accepted almost anything. You used to be the one to fix the tension, the one who couldn't stand distance. But now you can live in distance like it's peace. You don't force conversations anymore. You don't reopen doors. You've stopped revisiting places that once made you feel small. And that quiet withdrawal, it's loud to the people who once took your presence for granted. You stopped explaining yourself because you learned that people don't value what they don't have to work for. You stopped repeating yourself because they weren't hearing you, just waiting for you to back down. But now you don't speak twice. You speak once, maybe, then you act. That action, the exit, the silence, the blocked access, is what they never saw coming. They expected words, but words are emotional, and you're not emotional about it anymore. You're done. You don't need to say, "I'm done." You just are. You don't need to threaten to walk away. You just walk. No warnings, no build-up. That's what makes the shift so powerful. It's not dramatic, it's final, and they feel it. They reach out to see if the old you is still there, the one who always gave another chance. But that version doesn't live here anymore. They find out the hard way. It's in how you carry yourself now. No tension, no bitterness, no need to prove a thing. You walk like someone who survived being misunderstood and stopped caring about being liked. That energy is rare, and it's magnetic. People feel pulled toward you but can't access you the way they used to. You're polite, cordial, but closed. That polite coldness, it's a wall, not built from hate, built from healing. Your energy used to say, "I'm trying." Now it says, "I'm gone." It used to say, "Let's fix this." Now it says, "Do what you want, just not with me." And it stings, because they never thought you'd mean it, but you do. You've moved past proving your value. You show it now by who you give your time to, by what you tolerate, by what you walk away from without hesitation. They try to pull emotion from you. They try to create reactions, but you're calm. That's what scares them the most. You're not seeking revenge. You're not trying to hurt them. You're just unbothered. And that peace, that's louder than anything you could ever say. They feel it when your name comes up. They feel it when they see your progress, when they notice you never looked back. You became untouchable, not because you built walls, but because you rebuilt your worth. You became unavailable to people who never valued you when you were present. And that quiet shift, that subtle disappearance, that's what hits them hardest. You don't have to explain. You don't have to react. Your absence is the closure, and they'll keep feeling it without ever hearing a word. You don't react the way you used to. The version of you they were comfortable hurting, the one who always forgave without thinking twice, doesn't live here anymore. They didn't notice the change at first, because it wasn't loud. You didn't post about it, didn't send out warnings. You just stopped being soft where softness was wasted. You stopped folding yourself into shapes to make others feel whole. You stopped offering your warmth to people who only knew how to return cold. They thought you'd always stay the same, always be available, always say it's okay, even when it wasn't. You were the one who fixed things, even when you didn't break them. The one who said sorry just to keep the peace. But peace started costing too much. It started asking for parts of you that you couldn't get back, and something shifted quietly, permanently. You didn't become bitter. You became clear. You saw the patterns for what they were. You saw how people returned, not because they cared, but because they expected you to still be soft, to still care more than you should, to still take them back. But this version of you doesn't ask why they left, doesn't wonder what they're thinking, doesn't need to know what they feel, because none of it matters anymore. The softness wasn't the problem. It was who you gave it to. You were loyal to people who treated you like an option. You poured into people who never even asked if your cup was empty. You gave second, third, fourth chances to people who never once showed growth. And now they're shocked at how cold the silence feels. They're confused by the stillness, but you owe no explanation. You learned that kindness without boundaries becomes self-betrayal, that love without limits becomes a prison. They used to lean on you, drain you, and then disappear. But now, there's no door open, no space saved, no more late-night responses, no more energy spent trying to understand behavior that was always loud with disrespect. They feel the shift now, the conversations that don't happen, the apologies that won't be accepted, the version of you that would have cried, begged, explained, gone. You didn't force the change. Life did. Pain did. Silence did. And now, Your boundaries speak for you. Your absence explains everything. You don't need to yell to be heard anymore. You're not passive-aggressive. You're just done repeating yourself. You used to warn people when they were losing access to you. Now you just let them lose it. No threats, no emotional breakdowns, just locked doors, closed tabs, muted notifications, and peace that doesn't need anyone else's permission. Some people say you've changed, that you're distant, but you know better. You've always been this version of yourself. You just buried it under softness, under the fear of being seen as cold, under the hope that if you gave enough, they'd finally treat you right. But enough was never enough, so now you give nothing where nothing was earned. They miss the old you, the one who stayed through the chaos, who answered calls at 2 a.m., who forgave lies, who looked past neglect. But that version of you was built on pain, on survival, on the belief that you had to earn love through sacrifice. And you've killed that belief now, quietly, with purpose. You're not angry. You're just unavailable. You don't argue. You don't explain. You don't break yourself to prove your worth. You know what you bring. You know who you are. And the people who deserve access, they won't need to be convinced. They'll match you. They'll value you before they lose you. You've stopped filling spaces that emptied you. You've stopped being the soft landing for people who caused your hardest falls. You no longer allow people to confuse forgiveness with access. Forgiving them doesn't mean they get to return. You forgive, and then you move, without noise, without closure, without looking back. Now your silence does the talking. Your stillness holds more power than any long message ever could. They notice the difference. They feel the distance. They try to come close again, but something in your energy has changed. You're not angry, but you're not open. You're polite, but unavailable. You're calm, but untouchable. They test you with small things, casual messages, jokes, friendly comments, trying to find cracks in your new foundation. But you've cemented it now. You're not soft where softness was abused. You're not warm where warmth became expected. You're not loyal where loyalty was never mutual. They don't get to touch this version of you. This version moves differently, protects peace like it's sacred, loves but never blindly, gives but never past their limit, stays, but only when met with the same energy. You no longer need to prove your heart. The right ones will feel it without you setting yourself on fire to make it known. They regret thinking you'd never change, that you'd always be the one to fix things, that no matter what they did, you'd still be soft for them, that no matter how many times they disappeared, you'd still be waiting. But you're not waiting. You're not explaining. You're not warning. You're just gone. Now they sit with the silence they created. They feel the absence they laughed at. They remember the softness they mocked. But it's too late. You've stepped into certainty, into decisions that don't need group approval, into power that isn't loud, but unshakable. You didn't lose who you were. You just stopped giving that version of yourself to people who didn't deserve it. And now, every move you make is clear. No more justifying, no more hesitating, no more soft for the ungrateful. Just action, just peace, just you, finally choosing you.